January 2nd, 1963, a rice paddy outside a small village called Ap Bak. 13 American-made armored vehicles grind forward through the mud, engines roaring, tracks churning brown water into foam. Inside them, South Vietnamese soldiers believe they are invincible. The enemy hiding in the tree line has no tanks, no artillery, no air support, just rifles, and a handful of machine guns dug into the earth. On paper, this should not even be a fight. Then the shooting starts, and it becomes clear the enemy has been waiting for exactly this moment. They are not aiming at the thick aluminum hulls rolling toward them. They are aiming higher at the one place these machines cannot protect. Within minutes, gunner after gunner slumps forward in the open hatch, hit before they can even return fire. 14 men die at the same exposed post on the same afternoon. A vehicle built to be unstoppable has just revealed the one place it can be killed every single time. The generals who approved this machine called it a tin can before it ever left the factory. 6 decades later, it would still be rolling into combat, this time in the frozen fields of Ukraine. How does a vehicle survive its own worst day and outlive every machine sent to replace it? San Jose, California, June of 1960. The air inside the Food Machinery Corporation plant smells of hot metal and cutting oil. A finished hull rolls down the line under fluorescent light, and for a moment nobody moves. It does not look like a weapon. It looks like a shipping crate. Somebody bolted tracks onto flat sides, a blunt nose, no turret, no cannon, just a single machine gun sitting on an open mount at the top, waiting for a man to stand behind it with nothing but his own chest between him and the world. An inspector runs his hand along the hull plating. It feels wrong under his palm, too light. He knows what armor is supposed to feel like, the cold, dense weight of rolled steel, the kind that has protected soldiers since the first tanks crawled across the fields of the First World War. This metal feels closer to the siding on a house trailer. He asks the engineer standing beside him what it is made of. The engineer says one word, aluminum, the same alloy used in aircraft wings, in kitchen pots, in the folding lawn chairs, sitting in 10 million American backyards. Inspector does not laugh, but he wants to. Command has just spent a great deal of money on a vehicle that a rifle round designed 60 years ago could probably punch straight through. He is not entirely wrong to be afraid. He is also not being told the whole story. Outside the plant windows, the California sun beats down on rows of finished hulls waiting to be shipped, their paint still tacky, their interiors still smelling of fresh grease and factory dust rather than diesel exhaust and fear. None of them have felt the shudder of a river crossing or the crack of a bullet against their skin yet. They exist, for now, only as a bet, a very expensive bet, that the men who signed off on this program are still not entirely sure will pay off. To understand why this strange aluminum box exists at all, you have to go back 6 years to a war that had already ended and a lesson the United States Army had barely survived learning. Korea had exposed a gap nobody wanted to admit. American infantry needed a vehicle that could carry a full squad safely behind armor, keep pace with a tank across open ground, cross a river without waiting hours for engineers to build a bridge, and if necessary, to be lifted whole into the belly of a cargo plane and dropped somewhere the enemy did not expect. No vehicle in the American arsenal could do all four. Most could not manage two. The Army's first attempt was the M75, built first by International Harvester and then by FMC itself. It was fully enclosed, properly armored, and utterly impractical. It weighed nearly 19 tons, cost about $100,000 a unit at a time when that kind of money bought a house and a car to park in front of it, and it was far too heavy to fly and far too heavy to float. The Army built fewer than 1,800 of them before giving up. The second attempt swung too hard in the other direction. The M59 solved the cost problem by stuffing in a pair of cheap commercial truck engines instead of a proper military power plant. It was affordable. It was also so underpowered it could barely keep up with the tanks it was supposed to escort, and so mechanically unreliable that not a single one was ever trusted into combat. 2 attempts, 2 expensive failures, and an infantry force still riding into the nuclear age in vehicles that could neither keep up nor survive. Somewhere in the Pentagon, a procurement officer stares at the paperwork for both programs and feels the particular exhaustion of a man who has just watched $200 million of taxpayer money buy the Army nothing it can actually use in a war. The clock is not being kind. Soviet mechanized doctrine is advancing every year. This gap remains open. And every year, without a workable answer, is a year American infantry would go into the next war exposed. By June of 1954, engineers at the Detroit Arsenal had started sketching something different. A whole family of lightweight tracked vehicles built off one shared chassis instead of one bespoke design. 2 years of study followed before Continental Army Command finally signed off on full development in January of 1956. The contract landed on FMC's desk in San Jose, and the Army asked for something almost nobody had tried before: build 2 versions of the same vehicle side by side, one in steel, the way every armored vehicle before it had been built, one in aluminum, a material that had never carried the weight of a mass-produced fighting vehicle in its life. Test them against each other and let the results decide. The steel version was designated the T117. The aluminum version was the T113. On paper, the aluminum vehicle should have lost immediately. Every engineer in the room understood the basic physics. Aluminum is a softer metal than steel, and to stop the same rifle round or the same shard of shrapnel, an aluminum plate has to be roughly 3 times thicker than a steel, one doing the same job. That sounds like a losing trade before the argument even starts. Except the engineers working with FMC had found the twist buried inside that trade-off. A plate of aluminum 3 times thicker than the steel equivalent is also far more rigid on its own. It does not need the internal skeleton of steel reinforcing beams that a thin steel hull requires to keep from flexing and cracking under its own weight. Strip that internal skeleton out, and the vehicle gains back enormous interior space and loses weight overall. Even after accounting for the thicker plating, 2 vehicles built to stop the same bullet, the aluminum one, against every instinct in the room, comes out lighter. FMC partnered with Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation to develop a specialized alloy for the job, designated 5083, an aircraft-grade material never before asked to survive a battlefield. Welded into a hull, it tapered from 38 millimeters at the front glacis down to as little as 12 millimeters along the sides, thick enough to stop small arms fire and shell splinters, thin enough that the finished vehicle weighed in at just under 13 tons, light enough, for the first time in the program's history, to be carried whole inside a single C-130 Hercules transport plane and flown anywhere in the world the Army needed it. Power came from a Detroit diesel 6V53, a 2-stroke V6, producing roughly 215 horsepower, paired to an Allison TX 100 automatic transmission that let a single frightened 19-year-old drive it like a truck instead of wrestling a set of manual tank levers under fire. Top road speed came out to about 42 miles an hour. More importantly, the hull was fully amphibious with no preparation beyond raising a small trim vane at the front. point it at a river, drop the vane, and the tracks alone would push it across at a walking pace of 3.5 miles an hour. No bridge, no ferry, no waiting. On a full tank of diesel, it could travel over 300 miles before needing fuel again. Inside, a driver and a commander sat up front. Behind them, a cavernous troop compartment held 11 fully equipped infantrymen who could exit in seconds through a hydraulic ramp lowered at the rear instead of climbing out through a cramped top hatch under fire. Every dimension of the machine answered a question the Army had been asking since Korea. The weight answered the airlift question. The diesel engine answered the question of the catastrophic fuel fires that had haunted its gasoline-powered predecessor. The swimming hull answered the question of rivers and rice paddies half a world away that nobody in Detroit had specifically been thinking about yet, but soon would be, and the price tag, a mere $22,000 a unit in early production. A fraction of the M75's cost answered the question of how many the Army could actually afford to build. None of that mattered yet to the officers, standing in the San Jose plant in the summer of 1960, looking at a boxy aluminum shell with one exposed machine gun and no cannon anywhere on it. They could read the engineering reports. They could nod along to the numbers on weight and cost and airlift capacity, but standing in front of the real thing, hearing the hollow ring of a knuckle rapped against the hull, faith was a harder thing to manufacture than aluminum plate. Traditionalists inside the Pentagon had a name for it already, spoken half as a joke and half as a genuine warning. A tin can, others called it worse. A glorified taxi. A vehicle whose entire job was to carry soldiers to the edge of a fight and then turn around and run before the real shooting started. It carried no turret, no missile launcher, nothing that looked like the tanks and gun carriers that had defined armored warfare since 1917. By every traditional measure the United States Army used to judge a fighting vehicle, it looked like the most underwhelming machine the country had ever put into production. Production orders went out anyway. 900 vehicles, designated the M113, rolling off the same San Jose line by the end of June 1960. The first units reached American forces in Europe in 1961, quietly replacing the failed M59 in garrison after garrison, still untested, still unproven, still carrying nothing more dangerous than one machine gun and a reputation as the Army's cheapest disappointment. Nobody in that factory yet knew the name of a village in the Mekong Delta called Outback. Nobody yet knew that within 3 years, this aluminum box built to be flown anywhere and dismissed by nearly everyone who saw it would be tested in the single most unforgiving combat laboratory on Earth, and that the answer it produced would surprise every man who had ever called it a tin can. March 30th, 1962. 32 M113s roll off transport ships into the humid air of South Vietnam, handed over to 2 mechanized rifle companies of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The men assigned to crew them have trained on these machines for only a few weeks, learning to swim them across canals that look nothing like the training ponds back home, learning to read a delta landscape where the ground itself seems to shift between solid earth and standing water without warning. Within months, they are in combat against the lightly armed guerrillas of the Viet Cong. And for the first time, the aluminum box built to answer a Cold War question in Europe finds itself answering a very different question in the flooded rice paddies of the Mekong Delta. The terrain here bears no resemblance to the plains of Central Europe. The M113 was originally imagined defending waist-deep water, dense tree lines that swallow sound and hide move, canals crisscrossing the land in every direction, some barely wide enough for a sampan, others broad enough to stop a truck cold. Heat presses down on the crew compartment by mid-morning, the aluminum hull absorbing the tropical sun until the metal itself is almost too hot to touch. and the diesel fumes from the engine mix with the smell of mud and rot drifting off the paddies outside. It is, in almost every sense, the last place on earth anyone in San Jose had pictured this vehicle operating, and yet the very features that had seemed like compromises back in Detroit, the amphibious hull, the light weight, the shallow draft, turn out to be exactly what this terrain demands. A vehicle built to solve a hypothetical European tank chase finds itself, almost by accident, perfectly suited to a swamp on the other side of the planet. The results, at first, are staggering. The guerrillas hiding in the tree lines have never faced tracked armor that can simply drive through a canal and keep coming. Small arms fire that would have sent infantry diving for cover simply rings off the hull and the vehicle rolls forward anyway, crushing through brush and bamboo that no truck could ever cross. The psychological effect is immediate and total. According to accounts from that era, the Viet Cong give it a name of their own. Spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, they call it the Green Dragon for a few months. The aluminum tin can that Pentagon traditionalists had dismissed looks like exactly the kind of weapon that could win a counterinsurgency war on its own. Then comes January 2nd, 1963, and a village called Ap Bac, approximately 1,400 South Vietnamese troops, backed by American helicopters and a handful of American advisors, move against a Viet Cong force of roughly 350 fighters from the 261st and 514th Battalion. Captain Lai Tong Ba, commanding the 4th Mechanized Rifle Squadron of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, is ordered to push his 13 M113s across a canal near the village and crush the pocket of resistance dug in along the tree line. American advisor Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann pushes urgently for the armor to be committed, certain that once the Green Dragon arrives, the fight will be over quickly. What nobody on the South Vietnamese side realizes is that the Viet Cong have spent months studying exactly this vehicle. They have watched it in earlier engagements, noted where the bullets bounce and where they do not, and drawn a simple, brutal conclusion from the evidence. They know its hull can shrug off rifle fire. They also know something else, something far more specific and far more dangerous. The M113 single heavy machine gun sits on an open mount at the top of the vehicle, and the man operating it stands exposed from the chest up with nothing around him but air. It is the one part of this otherwise resilient machine that offers no protection at all. And the fighters waiting in the tree line have trained themselves not to waste ammunition on the hull. They aim higher. Fire discipline, in this one narrow sense, has been drilled into men with far less equipment and far less training than the soldiers riding toward them. And it is about to matter more in the next few minutes than anything ever written into an American engineering manual back in Detroit. As the M113s grind across the canal and into range, the Viet Cong open fire in disciplined, concentrated bursts, every one of them aimed at the exposed gunners. One biwane, the men standing behind those machine guns are cut down before they can bring their own weapons fully to bear. At least 14 South Vietnamese M113 gunners are killed in the fighting that follows. Struck down at the one post, the vehicle's designers in San Jose never imagined needed a shield. Drivers watch through narrow vision blocks as the men above them fall silent one after another. And without a gunner to suppress the tree line, the vehicles have no choice but to stop, exposed in the open paddy, engines idling. While the fight rages around them, radios crackle with confusion, voices talking over each other, urgent requests for orders that no one on the ground can yet fully answer. Reports reach Lieutenant Colonel Vann describing a battle that should have been a formality turning, minute by minute, into a rout. The advance stalls, The battle becomes the first major tactical defeat the Viet Cong ever inflict on South Vietnamese forces in a set-piece engagement, and it happens, in large part, because of a single exposed position on the roof of an otherwise nearly invulnerable vehicle. American newspapers pick up the story within days. And for the first time, ordinary Americans back home hear the name of a machine most of them had never known existed. Attached to a defeat nobody in Washington wanted to explain, journalists on the ground press advisors for answers, and the honest answer that a supposedly unstoppable armored vehicle had been beaten by the simple discipline of aiming at an exposed man rather than an armored hull does not sit comfortably with anyone briefing the story back in the United States. For the crews who survived the battle, the lesson is far less abstract. It is written in the empty seats behind the machine guns of 13 vehicles that rolled home that evening, carrying fewer men than they had carried that morning. For the engineers who designed the M113, this would have been a design flaw born of a mistaken assumption. The vehicle had been built under a doctrine that treated it as a battle taxi, a machine whose entire purpose was to deliver infantry to the edge of a fight so they could dismount and do the actual shooting on foot. Nobody in Detroit had designed it to fight while still carrying its crew inside, because nobody had expected it would need to. The reality of the war in Vietnam did not care what the doctrine assumed. Counterinsurgency combat in dense terrain rewarded crews who could fight mounted, firing from cover as they moved, and the open machine gun position, exactly as built, was a death trap for any man who tried. The fix did not come from a defense contractor or a Pentagon planning office. It came from the soldiers who had just watched their friends die behind that gun. By late 1964, crews from the 2nd Armored Cavalry and the 80th Ordnance Unit began welding improvised shields around the machine gun mount, using whatever scrap steel they could scavenge, some of it reportedly cut from the hulls of sunken ships. Men who had never held a welding torch before the war learned fast. Cutting and bending plate late into the night in makeshift motor pools, driven by the plain fact that the alternative was to keep sending gunners up into the open to die the same way their friends had. It was crude. It was not standardized. Some shields fit better than others. Some units improvised differently from the next, and none of it came from a blueprint. It worked well enough that survivors kept building more of them, and word spread from unit to unit faster than any formal order ever could have. By 1965, the United States Army had taken notice and formalized the idea into an official modification package known as the Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle Kit, or the CAV. It added a shielded turret around the .50 caliber machine gun, 2 additional shielded M60 machine guns mounted at the rear cargo hatches, and belly armor plating to guard against the mines that were becoming an increasingly common threat in the Delta. For the first time, a gunner standing at that position had steel around his shoulders and chest instead of open air, and the machine gun crews, who had once been the single most dangerous job on the vehicle, became, almost overnight, some of the best protected men in the entire formation. The M113 had not been redesigned. It was the same aluminum hull, the same engine, the same amphibious capability. What had changed was the men fighting inside it, who had taken a vehicle built to run from danger and rebuilt it with their own hands into a vehicle built to stand and fight. There is a particular irony in that the Pentagon had spent years and millions of dollars perfecting the hull, the alloy, the suspension, the transmission, every measurable engineering specification that could be written into a contract. The one thing that actually determined whether the vehicle survived combat, the shield around the gunner, came from soldiers with cutting torches in a motor pool, working off nothing but instinct and grief. The first large-scale American use of the ACAV configuration came during Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, conducted by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, known across Vietnam simply as the Black Horse. Columns of ACAVs pushed through the Iron Triangle north of Saigon, their triple machine guns able to suppress an ambush from 3 directions at once, instead of relying on a single exposed gunner who might be the first man killed in the opening seconds of contact. The transformation was now complete in every practical sense. A vehicle designed as nothing more than a transport, bristling now with 3 machine guns and improvised armor, had become a genuine fighting vehicle, a role its own creators had never intended for it and never planned around. By the height of American involvement, 10 full mechanized infantry battalions were operating across South Vietnam, and the ACAV had become the signature vehicle of the entire ground war, used for convoy escort, for deliberate assaults on fortified positions, for missions. No personnel carrier doctrine had ever written down on paper. Soldiers who arrived in country expecting to ride inside a taxi to the edge of a firefight instead found themselves manning a small mobile fortress, one that could absorb a hit, keep moving, and shoot back the entire time. Australian forces pushed the adaptation even further. The 3rd Cavalry Regiment and 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Troop fielded M113s fitted with Cadillac Gauge T, 50 turrets, creating a fire support variant that blurred the line between a personnel carrier and a light tank. Later, Australian modifications went further still, mounting Saladin 76mm turrets and Scorpion turrets onto the same aluminum hull that Washington had originally designed, to do nothing more than carry troops and retreat. Crews who had trained for a transport mission found themselves instead operating something closer to a cavalry gun platform, tracking targets through a proper turret sight instead of firing blind over an open hatch. All built on a chassis that had left the San Jose factory with a single machine gun and a reputation as the Army's cheapest disappointment. None of these transformations were coordinated from a single headquarters. Each nation, each regiment, sometimes each individual maintenance officer, looked at the same basic aluminum hull and asked the same question: what does this vehicle need to survive the war it is actually fighting, rather than the one it was designed for? The answers piled up faster than any single doctrine writer could have kept pace with. And the M113 absorbed every one of them without ever needing to be replaced. It was, in effect, being redesigned in real time by the very men whose lives depended on getting it right. A slow and unofficial process of trial and error playing out simultaneously across 6 armies on opposite sides of the planet. Some of the men who fought inside these machines became legends in their own right. On January 11, 1969, near An Lac in Bin Long Province, Captain Harold A. Fritz of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment found his 7-vehicle column ambushed on Highway 13. The attack came fast and from multiple directions at once. Rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons, fire tearing into the column before the lead vehicles had even fully registered. They were under fire. Fritz's own vehicle was hit and set ablaze within the opening seconds. Wounded in the opening moments of the attack, Fritz climbed onto the top of his own burning vehicle anyway, standing in the open in the same exposed position that had killed so many gunners at Ap-Bac 6 years earlier, to direct his men's fire and organize the defense while the fight raged around him. He refused to withdraw, refused to let the ambush scatter his column into easy targets, and held the position until the attackers broke off. He was awarded the Medal of Honor presented by President Nixon in March of 1971. Fritz went on to serve 27 years in the Army, eventually becoming president of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, a living reminder that the machine which had failed so badly at Ap-Bac could also carry a man through the worst day of his life, and out the other side, where the exposed gunners at Apback had died before they could fire a shot, the men fighting for McCav-equipped vehicles 6 years later had a fighting chance. And it was that chance, bought with scavenged steel and stubbornness rather than any Pentagon redesign, that let a wounded officer climb back into the open and still walk away. The cost of that endurance was steep. Between November 1967 and March 1970 alone, American and South Vietnamese forces recorded the loss of no fewer than 1,342 M113s to landmines, a grinding attrition far removed from the dramatic ambushes that made headlines, one that quietly wore down units mile after mile of rutted road and canal bank. By the fall of Saigon in April 1975, an estimated 1,381 South Vietnamese M113s had been destroyed or captured, and more than 1,000 fell intact into the hands of the advancing People's Army of Vietnam, some of which reportedly remained in Vietnamese service for years afterward, rolling under a different flag than the one they had been built to serve. The Green Dragon that had once terrified the Viet Cong ended the war as spoils on the winning side, its aluminum hull outlasting the government it had been sent to defend for the crews who had fought inside these vehicles for years. The final images of the war, columns of captured M113s rolling through the streets under a flag they had spent a decade fighting against, carried a bitterness that no engineering achievement could soften. The machine had done everything it was asked to do. It had simply been asked to do it on behalf of a government that ran out of time before the war did. Vietnam was not the last place. The M113's single greatest weakness would be tested, and the next proof came 2 years before Saigon itself fell on an entirely different continent. In October 1973, Israel fielded 448 M113 A1s across the Sinai and Golan fronts during the Yom Kippur War, rushed into a two-front fight against Egyptian and Syrian forces armed with the latest Soviet weapons. Israeli crews discovered exactly what the Viet Cong had already learned a decade earlier, delivered this time by a more modern weapon, shaped charge, warheads fired from Soviet, supplied rocket, propelled grenades sliced through the aluminum hull with disturbing ease, and the fires that followed inside the crew compartment were often catastrophic. The same aluminum that had made the vehicle light enough to fly and swim, now burning in a way steel armor never would. Israel's answer was to armor what it already had, producing an up-armored variant known as the Zelda, fitted with additional applique steel plating bolted onto the original aluminum hull, buying crews a measure of protection the factory version never offered. Israeli engineers eventually went a step further, building the Akseret, a separate and far heavier troop carrier constructed on captured Soviet tank chassis, specifically because the lesson of the M113 in two different wars, a decade and a continent apart, had made clear that no amount of field modification could fully solve the problem of a lightly armored hull against a modern-shaped charge warhead. Crews who had ridden the aluminum hull across the Sinai carried a healthy respect for what it could survive and an equally healthy fear of what it could not. A duality that would repeat itself in nearly every army that ever fielded the vehicle. It was never a question of whether the M113 would face this exact threat again. It was only ever a question of where, under what flag, and who would be riding inside it the day it finally happened again. 3 decades later, the same machine was still carrying American soldiers into danger. Its basic design almost unchanged since the day it rolled off the line in San Jose. On April 4th, 2003, during the opening days of the Iraq War, Sergeant First Class Paul Ray Smith of Bravo Company, 11th Engineer Battalion, 3rd Infantry Division, found his position at Baghdad International Airport overrun by a much larger enemy force, pressing in from multiple directions. His unit was outnumbered, casualties were mounting, and the position was on the verge of being overrun entirely. When the fighting turned desperate, Smith climbed onto the 50 caliber machine gun of a damaged M113, the same exposed position that had killed 14 men at Apbach 40 years earlier, and held his ground, fully aware of what that position had cost other men before him. He fired more than 300 rounds, killing an estimated 20 to 50 enemy fighters before he was struck down, buying enough time for approximately 100 of his fellow soldiers to survive the assault and hold the airport. He became the first American service member awarded the Medal of Honor in the Iraq War, and like Fritz before him, he lived his final moments in exactly the spot the M113's designers had never managed to protect more than 40 years. And 3 wars after that flaw had first been paid for in blood at Apbach, there is something almost unbearable, almost cruel, in that continuity. 3 different decades, 3 different enemies, 3 different flags flying over the battlefield, and the same narrow strip of exposed hull position claiming men who each, in their own moment, chose to stand there anyway because the fight demanded it. No engineering fix in any country, in any decade, ever fully closed that gap. What changed each time was not the vehicle, but the willingness of the men riding inside it to pay whatever price that one weakness demanded, and to keep the old machine moving forward regardless, war after war. The M113 did not survive 4 decades of continuous combat because it was invulnerable. It survived because it was good enough everywhere else that soldiers were willing to accept the one place it was not, and because enough of them, across enough wars, chose to stand in that gap rather than let the position go unmanned. Vietnam, the Sinai, Baghdad, 3 different wars, 3 different enemies, and the same aluminum machine at the center of all of them, carrying the same vulnerability and the same stubborn refusal to disappear. Each time it was declared a liability, and each time the men who actually had to fight from inside it found a way to keep it running, keep it useful, and keep it moving forward into the next war nobody had planned for it to fight. The frozen fields of eastern Ukraine, sometime after February 2022, snow crunches under tracks that have not changed in any fundamental way since a factory floor in San Jose 60 years earlier. Artillery rumbles somewhere beyond the tree line, and the same amphibious hull that once crossed canals in the Mekong Delta now grinds across frozen ruts of mud left by shelling, carrying a crew that was not yet born when this design was drawn up. Beginning that year, partner nations donated more than 1,000 M113s and their derived variants to Ukraine's armed forces, vehicles pulled out of storage depots across Europe, some of them sitting in reserve for so long that the soldiers uncrating them were younger than the paint fading on the hulls. They were refitted with bolt-on cage armor to defeat modern anti-tank rockets and fitted with Ukrainian-made remote weapon stations that finally, 6 decades late, let a gunner fire from inside the hull instead of standing exposed above it, closing at last the single vulnerability that had killed men at Apbach, in the Sinai, and at Baghdad airport. The aluminum box that was supposed to have been quietly retired decades earlier rolled back onto a battlefield against a peer adversary, carrying soldiers into a war that looks, in its trenches and its artillery barrages, disturbingly like the wars of a century before it. On paper, the vehicle Ukraine's opponents were fielding should have made the M113. An afterthought, the Soviet BMP-1, developed at roughly the same time as the American vehicle, carried a 73mm cannon, an anti-tank guided missile, and firing ports that let its infantry shoot from inside the hull while still moving. It was faster, it sat lower to the ground, offering a smaller target. It had been designed from its very first blueprint as an infantry fighting vehicle, a machine meant to fight alongside its passengers rather than simply deliver them somewhere else. The M113 carried one machine gun and was built on the assumption that its passengers would get out before the real fighting began. Judged strictly as a weapons platform, on a single afternoon, in a single fixed engagement, the comparison is simply not close. But the doctrinal comparison misses the point entirely. The BMP-1 was a specialist, built to do one job supremely well, and when that one job stopped matching the war it actually faced, it had very little left to offer. The M113 was something rarer and, in the long run, more valuable. It was a platform, a chassis flexible enough to become almost anything an army needed it to be. In almost any war, on almost any continent, decades after its original design brief had become irrelevant. The same basic aluminum hull that rolled off the San Jose line in 1960 was eventually adapted into more than 40 official variants. The M106 carried a mortar into battle. The M163 Vulcan mounted a rapid-firing 20mm rotary cannon that proved devastating against exposed infantry and low-flying aircraft alike. The M577 became a raised-roof command post, giving commanders room to plan a battle rather than fight one. The M901 improved tow vehicle carried twin anti-tank missile launchers on a mount that could rise fire and drop back below the hull line before an enemy gunner could return fire. The M548 hauled cargo. Other variants became ambulances, smoke generators, combat engineer vehicles, flamethrowers, even mobile launchers for surface-to-air missiles, every single one of them built on the same hull that had once been dismissed as a glorified taxi, with nothing to offer beyond hauling infantry to the edge of a fight. The closest thing the West produced to a direct rival was Britain's F-5 432, a personnel carrier built entirely of steel, heavier and more conventional in every respect. When Australia tested both vehicles side by side in 1962, the M113 won decisively on maneuverability and amphibious performance, exactly the qualities its designers had bet everything on a decade earlier. The FV432's total production run reached only around 2,500 vehicles. The M113's production run eventually exceeded 80,000, making it the most produced Western armored vehicle since the M4 Sherman tank rolled off American assembly lines during the Second World War. Only the Soviet T-54 and T-55 family, built in numbers approaching 100,000, was ever produced in greater quantity anywhere on Earth. Washington did eventually try to replace it. The M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle entered service in 1981, heavier, better armed, and vastly more expensive than the machine it was meant to succeed, built explicitly to fix the vulnerabilities that Vietnam and the Sinai had exposed. But the Bradley only ever replaced the M113 in the direct combat role it had been forced to grow into by accident in Vietnam. Every support function the Bradley could not fill, and there were dozens of them, remained the M113's job by default, quietly hauling ammunition, casualties, and command staff through every conflict the newer, heavier vehicle fought in alongside it. As late as 2023, the United States Army still fielded roughly 6,000 M113s, accounting for nearly a third of all tracked vehicles inside its armored brigade combat teams. A formal replacement, the Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle built by Before Anyone Else Systems, finally reached full-rate production that same year, priced at close to $7 million per vehicle, more than 300 times what the original M113 had cost in $1960. The Army planned to purchase roughly 2,900 of them. Even after that entire program is complete, several hundred M113s serving in higher echelon units will still have no funded replacement of any kind. Current projections suggest the M113 will not fully leave American service until sometime after 2030, 70 years after that first hull rolled off the San Jose line into the California sun, outlasting the careers of nearly every officer who once signed the paperwork to replace it. The rest of the world never stopped buying it either. More than 50 nations still operate the M113 today. Israel alone fields around 6,000. Egypt fields close to 3,000. Saudi Arabia fields roughly 3,000 more. Greece operates around 2,500. Pakistan fields upwards of 2,300 in garrisons and depots on every continent except Antarctica. Mechanics who are not alive when the last American unit rode the M113 into major combat still keep these hulls running. Ordering parts for a vehicle whose original assembly line closed decades before they were born. 6 decades after Pentagon traditionalists dismissed it as a tin can not worth the aluminum it was welded from. It remains one of the most widely fielded armored vehicles on the entire planet, quietly moving cargo, command posts, wounded soldiers, and infantry squads across every continent, where an army still needs a reliable set of tracks under a soldier's feet. There is no single dramatic reason why a machine this simple has outlived nearly every rival built to replace it. There is only the accumulation of thousands of small, unglamorous decisions made by mechanics, by procurement officers, by soldiers welding scrap steel onto a gun mount in the middle of a war, none of whom ever set out to build a legend. They were only ever trying to keep the vehicle in front of them running one more day, through one more ambush, one more river crossing, one more winter. The legend, in the end, is simply what all of those small decisions look like. Once you add them up across 70 years, return for a moment to that factory floor in San Jose in the summer of 1960. An aluminum box rolls off the production line. It weighs less than 13 tons. Its armor will not stop a rocket-propelled grenade. Its armament is a single machine gun manned by someone standing in the open with nothing around him but air. It has no cannon, no missile, no fire control computer, no night vision, no air conditioning, no protection against nuclear, biological, or chemical weapon. By every measure a defense contractor uses to sell a vehicle to a government today, it looks hopelessly inadequate. And yet it worked. It worked in the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta and the sand dunes of the Sinai. It worked in the mountains of Lebanon and the streets of Baghdad. It worked in the frozen mud of eastern Ukraine, 6 full decades after the last rivet was welded into its first hull. It worked, despite the exposed gunner's position that killed men from Apbak to Baghdad, despite the aluminum hull that burned when a shaped charge found it. Despite every honest warning, the traditionalists in the Pentagon had raised the day it rolled off the line. It worked because it was light enough to fly anywhere on Earth, simple enough for a teenager to learn to fix in the field, cheap enough that no general ever had to think twice before risking it, and adaptable enough to become whatever the soldiers riding inside it needed it to become. In whatever war they happened to find themselves fighting, more than 80,000 were built across 6 decades of continuous production. More than 40 official variants were created from that same basic hull. More than 50 nations bought it, and some are still buying parts and upgrades for it today. Decades after the original line closed, the M113 was never, on any single day, the best armored vehicle on any battlefield it ever entered. It was never the fastest, never the toughest, never the most heavily armed machine rolling across any of those fields. It was simply the one machine that showed up, absorbed whatever the war demanded of it, and refused decade after decade, war after war, to go away. That is not glamour. That is not innovation in the way the word usually gets used. It is something quieter and, in the end, far harder to build. It is the difference between a weapon designed for one war and a vehicle built almost by accident for every war that came after it, right up to the one still being fought in the frozen mud of Ukraine as this story is being told